Configuring high availability Fortigate cluster. One expert said, always plan, prepare, and expect a failure. In this video, we will be deploying two Fortigate units in an active passive cluster to protect your environment from unexpected outages and disaster recovery situation. When you have multiple Fortigate units, this can be an investment that can help you in the long run when you have outages or you have service interruption. Maybe you have an internet outage in one site. You can use the other Fortigate to handle this disaster situation. Let's take a look at our lab in this video. We are deploying a fresh pair of Fortigate units that will act as an active passive cluster. This uses the Fortigate clustering protocol built directly inside the FortiOS, and all it requires from us is to have a direct connectivity between the Fortigate on the same board. So in this case, I'm using board 2 to connect both Fortigates using a direct link, and then I'm having internet connectivity on board 1 to my NAT gateways. Those are the same like a cloud gateway on GNS3, and my internal network is behind board 3, where I'm going to have multiple machines for testing our redundancy. And finally, we have a dedicated management network, so we can have a unique IP for each firewall so we can manage it separately. So let's see how we can build it. First, let's open our first Fortigate. This is usually going to be called the primary unit. Once we log in inside, let's check our interfaces first. Get system interface. I have no IPs right now on any of the board. So let's see how we can start building our cluster. First, let's make a route to the internet on board 1 by going into config, router, static. We're going to add a new entry. Now we can configure our default route by setting device to board 1. This is the board I'm connected to the internet. And if we do a show, anything that doesn't have a destination defined is a default route. You can verify this by doing the command get. And we can see that the default value for destination is 0000/0. So this is a default route. Now let's verify that our route had been added by putting the command get router info routing table all. I see I have a default route connected on board 1. And now let's give this Fortigate a unique name. Under config system global, we can put the command set host name, and we can call this one primary firewall. Once we get out of this menu, now we have a unique name for our primary firewall. Now we can start configuring our internal interfaces. Let's go under config system interface. And we're going to edit board 2 first. This is the board that we're going to dedicate for our heartbeat. We don't need to configure any IP addresses in here, but we can use the command set alias to give it a unique name identifier. We can call this heartbeat. This is the protocol that will run between the firewalls. So this step is just to identify the board and the purpose that we are using it for. Next, we're going to modify our board 3 configuration. This is our internal network. So the firewall will own the router IP in this case. We're going to put the command set IP 10.0.10.1/23, and we can give this one an alias of internal, and we can allow access for ping. We do the command show, we verify all our information is correct, and then we can do next. Finally, we need to define a dedicated management port. We can manage each firewall separately using their own IP address. The way we can do this, we can edit and create a new interface. Let's call it management. In this, we can put set type, and the default type in here is going to be a VLAN. And this time we need set type loopback. And then we can put the command set IP, and we have a /29 network in here for our dedicated management, 172.20.0.0/29. We can use set IP 172.20.0.4/29 for our primary firewall. And we want to allow Bing for this interface as well. And finally, we need to define the VDOM name. As we are not using any virtualization on this instance, we can just add the default VDOM, which is root. And we can click next. Now we have all our interfaces ready. So if we do a show command, we have our port 1 interface. We have our port 3 IP address in here. And we have our management interface. Now we can start configuring our DHCP server so our PCs on this site can get IP addresses. So we can do config system DHCP server. We're going to create a new entry. And then we will set the interface to be port 3. This is our internal network. We're going to set the default gateway to 10.0.10.1. And then we're going to set the net mask to /23. And finally, we config our IP range by creating a new entry under config IP range. In this case, we can start our IPs at 10.0.10.2 and our IPs will end at 10.0.11.254. Once we get out of this, we have now a policy to allow our clients to get our DHCP IPs from this /23 range. So let's test this out. From our first PC, let's do a DHCP command. So now I have gotten an IP address on this subnet as well. And on PC number 2, I got the same result. I got 10.0.10.3/23. So now I have an IP address on both of my end users. Now let's quickly head back to the firewall and create a basic policy to allow Bing to the internet. We can use this as a test from our instance. We can create a policy simply by going under config firewall policy. We're going to create a new entry for our interface that is incoming. This will be port 3 where my PCs are located in my internal network. And my destination will be the internet. I want to do a destination interface port 1. I want to allow all addresses for source and destination. And we will allow the service to be ICMP. We're going to allow the action to be accept. And we will allow the schedule to be always. Those are all the important information you need to include to allow the policy to be created. And finally, since we are going to the internet, we need to enable our overload single outgoing interface NAT option by putting the command set NAT enable. And once I do next, now this policy has been saved. Let's try from our PC to Bing the internet. And I'm getting a timeout because for now port 1 still doesn't have IP address. It's connected to the internet. So let's keep this running for a second. And from here, let's go back to our interface. And under port 1. And under port 1, we will do the command set mood DHCP. And we put end. Once port 1 negotiates with the NAT gateway and gets an IP address, the traffic should start working. As we see, we start being able to Bing the internet. Now, if we try to Bing by name, such as yahoo.com, we can't resolve it because we have not set a DNS on our DHCP server. So let's go back to our config system DHCP server. And we need to make sure that when we assign DHCP IP addresses to our clients, we have to define our DNS server. So we're going to do our entry in here is verified. This is my DHCP IP for port 3. Let's add one command here by set DNS service. And if I want to enable DNS in my DHCP, I have different option. I can either assign it to a local or the same DNS configured on the Fortigate, or I can specify. I want to do a specify, and if I do a set, I can do DNS server 1, DNS server 2, DNS server 3. So we can do DNS server 1 and put 1.0.0.1, and for our server 2, we will put 1.1.1.1. So now we have set DNS server 1.0.0.1 and 1.1.1.1. Now let's get out of the DHCP server to save these configuration changes. And finally, we need to modify our policy to allow DNS as well. So let's go back to config firewall policy, and we're going to edit our single policy in here. And remember, we added only all ICMP. Let's add one more service to it, which is DNS. Let's request a new IP address to make sure we get the DNS settings. And now let's do a command again, ping yahoo.com. And this way I'm able to resolve and reach public internet with no issue. Now we can start configuring our Fortigate cluster. First, we will start by our main unit or primary unit. I will do the command config system HA. This way we can start configuring our cluster. First, let's do a show, and I don't have any information here, so nothing is enabled. First thing we need to define is we need to define the operation mode of our cluster. The way we configure this, we put set mode, and if we put a question mark, it's either standalone, which is the default option, that means every firewall operates alone, and then we have active, that means both firewalls are actively passing traffic in the same time. And active passive is the mode we will be using today, which is one device passing traffic and one device on standby if the main firewall fails. And active passive is the most commonly used architecture for deploying Fortigate in a cluster. So we will be using active passive. The next thing we need to define a group ID and a group name. Those need to be unique and need to be the same in both firewalls in our cluster. We can choose any number between 1 and 255 for our group ID. And the reason for using this, you can have multiple clusters in your environment, and you will use different group IDs and group names to separate clusters from talking to each other. So let's call this one group ID 20, and let's call our group name cluster office. We need to put a password for the communication between these firewalls. So let's do a command set password, and let's call it Fortinet. Next, we need to allow the firewalls to keep a shared session table, and if the main firewall fails, the second firewall should be able to continue a TCP session in the middle without causing an interruption to the end user. The way we do this, we can put the command set session backup enable. Next, we need to define which port are we using for the heartbeat. As we see in this case, we have a direct connection on port 2 between the both firewalls. So we will put the command set HP device, heartbeat device, and we will use the command port 2. Then we need to give it a priority in case we have multiple ports. So I'm just gonna put 100. Next, we need to define a priority for the device. And the higher priority you are, the more likely you will be the master of the cluster. So in this case, we can also choose a number between 1 and 255. I want to set the priority on the main device to be 200. And I will set the other side for the slave unit as 100 to make sure the master has higher priority. Finally, we need to let the Fortigate cluster know that our interface for loopback, where we have our dedicated management, is unique among the firewalls. So you do not want to share this information or this IP address between both firewalls. So first we need to put set HA management status enable. And this way we can put a config HA management interfaces. This way you can define up to 4 ports that are going to be unique on each firewalls that will not share the IPs between the Fortigate cluster. First, we're going to need to add an entry inside, and we're going to put the command set interface, and in here we can put the interface that we dedicated for management, which is our loopback interface, and we click end. Now if we do a show, we have our group ID, we have our group name, we have our mode active passive, we have encrypted form of our password for the cluster, our heartbeat device is set to port 2 with 100, we have session backup enabled to make sure the firewalls will allow traffic to continue if the primary firewall fails. Our management status is enabled to allow the Fortigate to have some unique IPs for certain interfaces and do not share it in between the cluster members. Finally, we have our priority set to 200. So this way I have everything configured in the Fortigate master unit. I can click end and I can start working on my secondary Fortigate. In here we are not going to configure anything beside a few items. First, we need to give this Fortigate a unique name. So we're going to start by going into system global, and we're going to set our host name to be backup firewall. So now I have my unique name, and then we're going to configure our interface. We need to create a management as well. And here we're going to allow this to be a type loopback. We're going to give it an IP address 172.20.0.5/29. So now I give it a unique IP compared to the management interface on the primary firewall, which has .4 as an IP address. Second, we're going to add our VDOM root, and we're going to allow access for Bing. So now I have all the unique items configured on this Fortigate. I don't need to configure port 3 or DHCP server or anything. If I go right now under config system interface and I do a show, I have nothing on port 1, nothing on port 3, nothing on port 2. Now let's see how we can configure the heartbeat on this side by going into config system HA. We need to use the same information from the other firewall. We can keep it open here on the side. We're going to have a group ID of 20 as well. We're going to have a group name, cluster office. We're going to set the password as the same we set on the other one. We're going to set the mode to active passive. We're going to set the heartbeat device to port 2 as well with the same priority. We can put session backup enable. We will put set HA management status enable. And we're going to config HA management interfaces. Edit 1. Set interface management. And in this specific unit, I will set the priority to only 100. Now, if I do the command show, and by comparing it, I should have a good starting point to configure this as a heartbeat. Now, before I save this, I want to start capturing on this interface so I can show you what kind of communication will happen once I enable heartbeat. Right now, there is nothing going on, just normal broadcast. But if I go to the Fortigate unit and I do end, now the Fortigate will start communicating on the heartbeat. Now if we look in the packets going in between, we will see some configuration information being shared between the Fortigates. We see here some DNS versions, some serial numbers are being shared in between, and it's using layer 2 directly to communicate between the cluster members. In here we can see the backup firewall is showing me that the slave external files are not in sync with the master. That means there is a communication in between the devices, but they still need to configure each other to match directly. So this dictates who's master and who's slave That means the master is going to transfer his configuration to the slave unit, and the slave unit will apply the same configuration on his side, and then they will be both in sync. So let's go to our Fortigate 1 and let's do the command git system HA status. And if we look here, we can see first our event list, that this Fortigate in here is chosen as master because it has higher priority, and that's because we configure our primary firewall with 200 and the slave firewall for 100 only. We can see that it's able to read that there are two devices on the same time. One of them is this specific device, and the other one it says out of sync as it's doing this process. And it's also able to see how much sessions and how much CPU memory and all metrics is between both cluster members. And once our sync is successful, it's gonna kick us out of our SSH session. If I go back admin and I log in into my instance, if I do the command one more time, git sys HA status, I have now my status in sync for both firewalls, and it shows me that this specific unit is right now a slave and my primary firewall is master. Let's do the same command on this firewall, and in here I'm also in sync. So now both firewalls are in sync. Let's check the configuration side on the backup firewall, which we did not touch for the interface side. Now I see that port 3 configuration has been shared directly into here, and port 2 is also have the alias. Now if I do config firewall policy, I do a show, the same policy that I created on the primary firewall has been copied in here. So now our heartbeat is operating perfect, but I'm not really monitoring anything on this heartbeat. So this is not gonna work until we configure our monitoring metrics. So under config system HA, we need to monitor the ports that are connected to our internal network. We can do the command set monitor port 3, but also if the internet goes down on one side, we need to make sure we are using the backup unit for the internet as well. We're gonna be monitoring port 3 for connectivity to our internal network, and we're gonna monitor port 1 for connectivity to the internet. So let's do a show again. Now I just added this command. If I do end, and I go on the other side, and I do the same command, config system HA, and do a show. Now this has been copied directly in here as well. So now let's do our test. So I want to open my both PCs in here, and I want to run a continuous ping to the internet to test this functionality out. So I want to do ping yahoo.com -t, and in here I want to ping google.com -t. And this way I have direct connectivity to the internet to make sure that my redundancy work. Now let's test our failover scenario or a disaster recovery scenario. And let's say that you had an outage in your data center and this cable had went down, or the switch board had went down. So now I remove this link, and if I go back to my PCs, you notice I only lost one line of ping. And this is when the firewall immediately noticed that the board had went down and directed the traffic to use the backup unit. We go to our Fortigate 2 and do the command git system HA status. Now I see that my backup firewall is now master and the slave unit is primary. And if we check why has this changed from what we seen previously, we can go to our event log on the top. We see that at 1850, this firewall is selected as master because it has the least value 0 of link failure. So that means the other one has a link failure of 1, which is port 3 is down on the primary firewall. Therefore, the cluster had suddenly moved to the backup unit to make sure that you have no outage, as we see in here. Now, if we connect back our interface on port 3 to the switch, And if we open back our Fortigate 2 and we do the same command again, git system HA status, we see that this is still primary and the primary is still slave. If we want one firewall to always come as primary after backup from a disaster or an outage, we need to enable the overwrite feature on the main firewall unit. So under FortiGate unit number 1, we need to go under config system HA. We need to set override enable. We do a show right now. I have override enable on this side, and this is one of the options that will not copy over to the second firewall because it's device specific and you need to define it in each firewall separately. So if we go in here under config system HA, we do a show, the override is disabled in here. That means if the primary firewall is up, it's gonna stay up. If it goes down, FortiGate number 2, my backup unit, will be the new master, but once the primary unit comes back up, it will take over again. Let's test this out. We come in here again and do the command git system HA status. We can see that the master firewall had moved again to primary firewall. And if we check our pings, we will see that we barely lost any ping connectivity to the internet. So with us moving between Fortigate 1 to Fortigate 2 to Fortigate 1 again, we barely lost any ping packets during all this time, and we maintained a highly available cluster in our environment. Now, this scenario had assumed that we have both firewalls on the same location, therefore we have ability to directly connect them. Now, if we are using two FortiGate on two different data centers and you're trying to make this kind of setup to have a data center failover to another data center, you can still use this direct connectivity through a fabric extender or a software-defined network. So you can use OTV or VXLAN to extend this layer 2 connectivity to your other data center. And that's how you configure FortiGate active-passive cluster for high availability and redundancy. Thank you for watching.